In this video, we're going to go through an example of writing code at the client level to accomplish a particular task using a list and then using a bag. So we're going to look at the first part of exercise 11 in chapter 12, a little bit of a modified version of that. Basically what this exercise is asking you to do is assume that you have a list of quiz scores and you want to remove the lowest score from the list. Now we're writing code at the client level, which means we only have access to the methods listed in the interface. We don't know how these methods are implemented, and we don't care how these methods are implemented. All we know is we know the specifications given about each method and the methods that we have. So this is all we can use. Again, that's what it means to write code from the client level, is that we only have access to those interface methods, and we have to use them in the way that they're described in terms of knowing what the parameters should be and what the various methods return to us. Okay, so we're going to assume that we have that quiz scores list is of type list interface and holds integers, just to keep things simple. So the first thing we want to think about is what we should do if our list is empty. And if our overall task, remember, is to remove the lowest score from a list. But if our list is empty, we don't have anything to remove. So we really don't want to execute this code at all if our list is empty. So the very first thing we want to make sure is that quiz score list is not empty, using the isEmpty method from our interface. This is a common consideration that you'll take throughout this course with a lot of different data structures. You often want to do one thing if their data structure is empty and something else if the data structure has something in it. In our case, for this example, we don't want to do anything if the list is empty. Oftentimes you want to do something, but something different. So that's always something you want to consider is, will my code work if my data structure is empty? Generally, you don't want your code to crash if your method's invoked or your code is invoked with an empty, in this case list, or an empty data structure of any kind. You usually just want to take some kind of different action. Okay, so we're going to go ahead now and assume that we're inside our if statement, so our quiz score list has some scores on it, at least one. So the first thing we need to think about is, how can we find the lowest score on the list? Well, we'll probably have a variable to store the lowest score, but we need to initialize that variable. Now, kind of a common mistake that I've seen people make before is they initialize to -1, and then they write the rest of the code, and then it's not working, and it's kind of tricky to figure out why. Well, if we assume that the lowest score is -1, and then we compare, let's say, a bunch of scores between 0 and 100 to -1, -1 is always going to be smaller than anything on a list that spans 0 to 100, so we're never going to find the minimum on that list. So that's kind of a common mistake. We're thinking about minimums, so we say, okay, let's assign our minimum to a low value. But that's actually not what we want to do. Another approach we could do is, let's say, all right, well, if all my quiz scores are going to be between 0 and 100, let me assign my minimum initially to 101, and then whatever the minimum is on my list, it's guaranteed to be less than this, because everything on my list is going to be less than this. And if we knew for certain that all of our quiz scores were going to be between 0 and 100, then this would be an okay approach. But what if all of a sudden we want to use this code with quiz scores that go from 0 to 200? Then this approach is not going to work. So a better approach that'll make our code more user-friendly for any range of quiz scores is to say, all right, let me just assume that the lowest score on this list is located in the very first position. Now, how can I access the first position of my list? Well, I want to use those methods available to me, so I say quiz score list dot get entry at position 1. Remember that our lists in the list interface, in any class that implements list interface, start at position 1. Now, I know that something is going to be at this position because I know that my list isn't empty. So it has to have at least one score in it, and that score, even if it only had 1, would be at position 1. Now, this would be a good place for me to use an assert. I'm going to assert that the lowest score is not equal to null. Right? So I am asserting that something I already know to be true. I used a conditional to make sure that my list was not empty, and then I retrieved the element on the first position of my list. If this conditional worked properly, I am guaranteed that lowest score is not equal to null, that I got a valid value back for that lowest score. This is the proper use of asserts. It's inside of a conditional to confirm something that you believe is true. If you're not sure about this, please post a question to the discussion board. Okay, so again, going back to our general approach for finding the minimum, what I'm going to do is I'm going to assume that the minimum is located in the first position. If that turns out to be where the minimum really is located, then I'm fine. And if the minimum is located somewhere else, I'll eventually find it, compare it to the entry at position 1, and find out that that other number is smaller, and then I can update the minimum at that point. Okay? So I want to keep track of the current lowest score, and also the position of the lowest score, which right now is in position 1. Now what I want to do is I want to go through the rest of my list, and I can use a for loop to do that. So I want to now start looking at position 2, and I want to go up to and including quizscorelist.getLength. If my list has 10 things on it, the last thing will be in position 10. So I need to make sure that this loop goes up to and including that final element. And I want to look at each element of my list. Now, what happens if I only did have one element on my list? Would I get an error here? I would be 2, and quizscorelist would be 1, or quizscorelist.getLength would be 1. But remember that for a for loop, this condition is always checked before we ever go inside the loop. 2 is not less than or equal to 1. So if I only had one element on my list, I'd never even get into this for loop. So I'm totally fine with doing this. I don't need to double check that my list has at least 2 in it. The for loop will do that for me. Okay, so then what I can do is I can say the current score I'm looking at is the quizscorelist.get the entry at position I. And then what I want to do is I want to compare what I think is the lowest score to this current score. So if the current score that I'm looking at is less than the lowest score, well then guess what? It's the new lowest score. It's my new minimum. And also my new minimum position is going to be whatever position I'm in, I. So I basically do that for the whole loop, right? I look at the first integer, assume that's the smallest, then I look at the next one and say, is it smaller? Then I look at the next one and say, is it smaller? Let's say it is, that's my new minimum. Then I look at the next one and say, is it smaller than that new minimum? And so on and so on. When I get all the way through my for loop, I now have the lowest score stored in this variable and the position of that score stored in this variable. So remember, my overall task is to take that score off the list. So what I can do is say quizscorelist.remove from the lowest score position. So that's an example of writing code at the client level using the list interface to accomplish a task. Some key takeaways from this are we are always invoking the methods of list interface on an object, right? So it's not just get entry or get length, but we need to invoke those things on an object of the appropriate type. Our lists start at position 1. Okay, so that's very important to remember that for our interface, that's a decision made by the designer, so we have to abide by it. This is an example of a proper use of assertions. And to go along with the idea that our lists start at 1, our lists go up to and including get length. Okay, so there's an example of code from the client level using the list interface.